You're listening to The Sacred Sofa, a podcast that explores all things theology and therapy. My name is Grace Brown. I'm a registered psychotherapist, certified Canadian counselor, and owner of Journey with Grace Counseling Services.
And I'm Brad Watson, pastor of Nexus Church and author of the book, A Path Called Compelling. Welcome to The Sacred Sofa.
Well, welcome back, Brad. Happy New Year to you and our Sacred Sofa listeners.
Yes, thanks, Grace, and Happy New Year to you as well. I hope that you and those listening in had a wonderful holiday season and maybe were able to find some downtime, hopefully some rest and rejuvenation. And here we are, 2025 in a new year. And of course, the beginning of a new year is always a good opportunity to take stock of our lives and reassess. So let's get at that. Where are we heading now, Grace?
Yes, absolutely. So earlier in our season 2, along with our listeners, you and I have been exploring what it means to live the good and flourishing life. And of course, as we enter a new year, it is, I would think as well, fitting that we would continue with that theme of the good and flourishing life. So how about you tell us where Jesus takes us next in his Sermon on the Mount?
Right. We're in a new chapter here in the Sermon on the Mount, and Jesus enters a new section of his sermon as well. And he's dealing with personal piety. I know that's not a word we throw around a lot, but Jesus is exploring how we should practice our values, our virtues in life, and how each of us, of course, probably has a different list of actions of what we do that we would consider virtuous, right? For some, it might be serving meals at a soup kitchen or volunteer coaching sports, even just trying to be a patient parent or a partner, right? Visiting the elderly, giving money to a certain cause. The point is that there are things we do in life by necessity, right? Like we go to work, things we do out of self-interest, parenting, or maybe we go for a day at the spa, whatever it is. And then there are things in life we do simply because we consider them to be good things in and of themselves. And this is what this section is about here. Jesus wants to teach us how we do and practice virtue. And unfortunately, he starts with money. I know that's always a bit of a touchy one, but Jesus speaks about generosity. And his message isn't just that we should be generous, but that there are good and not so good ways to practice generosity.
Okay.
So I'm curious, Grace, having set that up from a psychological, therapeutic lens, how might you frame the virtuous aspects of our lives? Like, do you ever encounter people who come to you, look, hey, I'm trying to be more virtuous, or maybe they just want to better themselves, add more good to the world? Does that happen? And if so, how do you advise them?
And I'll start with this. You're right. The concept of piety and virtue or virtues usually isn't wordage
Right.
that we use in our day to day. And, I don't recall anyone coming to therapy saying, I want to be more virtuous. Yes, often there are people say, I want to be better or better themselves, especially in relationship. So those are some of the concepts folks will come with. This idea of virtue, I wanted to just back up a little. By definition, a virtue is a moral excellence, a beneficial quality, or a commendable trait. And we got some examples of that, like courage, truthfulness, patience, gratitude, kindness. And through the years working with clients, many come to improve various aspects of their lives and improve their relationship with self and others. I think a concept that is more virtue adjacent is something that we call values.
Okay.
And I would suggest that in some way these concepts can be interchangeable. So one of the things I do work with clients who want to explore how they want to better themselves or their relationships, which that says to me, this is important.
Yeah.
And so that automatically clues me into a place where we seek to look at values. And some of the work I've done with folks around values is with Brené Brown's work,
Right.
Living Inside Your Values. And I've also taken a lot of my material from a writer, Nir Eyal. He's a behavior and habit designer. And he actually did quite a bit of research and narrowed down domestically and internationally. He did a broad global scope of a survey and narrowed down 20 common values around the world.
Oh, fascinating.
And I really liked a lot of his research and the results he came up with. And a lot of the virtues that we're going to be talking about, including generosity, actually aligns with values that people have in terms of caring for others, altruism,
Mm,
which we'll speak
mm-hmm.
about
Mm-hmm.
further in our episode. But he has a simple test in terms of if something is important to you as far as a value. And his question is if someone can take it away from you, then it's not one of your values. And I think that's a
Interesting.
really good
Huh.
litmus test, because even values for some people can be a hard concept to sort of narrow down. It's like, what do you
Mm,
mean by values? And it's those core beliefs or core things that are important that can't be moved, right? And you and I are going to talk in this episode about the virtue of generosity and
mm,
how that is something Jesus is saying it should not be moved.
mm-hmm. That is good stuff.
So, when working with clients, the reflection exercises help them identify what are some of those core values they have and want to live by. And again, sometimes it can be a challenge for folks to understand that concept because it's a foreign idea for them to consider values as a compass that guides their beliefs and their actions.
Mm,
So, I'm going to ask you a question. I'm
okay.
curious to explore more about this personal piety. Another word for that would be duty
Mm,
in terms of practicing virtue or living inside the values of our lives. Of the list of values, I think it's very interesting that Jesus' next section of the Sermon on the Mount is actually on generosity
mm,
and giving money in particular. So,
mm,
can you take us further into that? What is the state of generosity as a practice at the moment?
mm. Yeah, and first of all, thank you for what you just added there. That's good. Can you just say for our listeners again the name of that author?
Now, Brad, you know how I am with pronouncing people's
Yeah, no,
names.
I know. Okay, or the book. Like I think that's really fascinating to look at values there.
So the article is called 20 Common Values and Why People Can't Agree on More, because
Mm.
they
Oh,
narrowed it down to
interesting.
20
Okay. Okay.
global values.
Yeah.
And this is taken from a book, but he wrote an article, Near, Nir Eyal,
Yeah.
Eyal.
Okay. That
So if
sounds
you
like a
were to
great
Google 20
resource.
common values, it'll
Yep.
pop up. Yeah.
Perfect.
Pretty
Yeah.
interesting research.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to look into that more. And that's really helpful as we set this up. And I love how you bring it in. We might not say things are virtues, right? But I think that's just a syntax thing, a
Mm,
verbiage thing, right? Where we can be talking about the same thing. But yeah, when it comes to generosity, I got thinking about this. And I was like, you know what? How generous are we Canadians?
mhm.
Sort of sent me down a little rabbit trail here, which got me fascinated. But how does Canada do when it comes to being generous? I was surprised to learn in terms of world ranking, according to the World Index of Giving Funds, Canada finished eighth in the world, which sounds impressive initially until you hear some of the other countries in the top eight as well. So number one most generous country in the world is Indonesia, which I never would have guessed.
Mm, mhm.
Second is Kenya. The United States is in third. Australia and New Zealand take four and five. Myanmar, which some people know as Burma, is six. Sierra Leone in seven. And Canada in eighth. And this really shocked me because I think eighth is
Interesting.
actually a pretty good spot to be in. But at least four of those countries are countries we would consider here in the West to be countries far less well off than
Hmm.
we are.
Hmm. Hmm.
So that intrigued me initially, and then I wanted to, get a little bit more into this generosity and Canadian questions. So I started reading all these annual reports. Some boring reading, but the Fraser Institute, Canada Institute for the Research on Public Policy, and what seems to be coming up is that Canadians seem to be getting less and less generous. So the
Mm.
current stat is this: in Canada, less than one in five Canadians who filed taxes, so anyone who's working maybe around the age of 16, 17, 18, less than one in five donated to charity. So only 18% of Canadians give charitably at all.
Hmm.
Nationally, it's 17.7. Ontario is 18.2, so, there's a,
Mm.
a few, but generally around that 18% mark. And of
Interesting.
course, that number, right, is just without context. What is more concerning is that if you look at year over year, those numbers continue to shrink. So, for instance, in
Mm,
2011, 24% of people were giving charitably. If you go back to 1985, it's well within the 30%. So, we're seeing this sharp decline over the years to now we're at the point of 18%.
mm,
And there was a whole task force, this public policy research group in Canada, going, why are Canadians getting less generous? So John Howard, he was responsible for doing some findings into this. And what he did, which I think is really impressive, is he tried to develop an even more inclusive definition of generosity. So not just what we do with our money, how we volunteer our time, do we give blood, help our
mm.
neighbors.
Okay.
Even with all of those, he found our generosity numbers can continue to plummet, you could say. But
Mm,
I think what was the most interesting thing to me for some reflection, and maybe I'll hand it over to you after I read a quote from him, is the reasons why. So he talks about there's
hmm
many different reasons why we're getting less generous, but then he names the three big ones. So he says this: first, greater economic pressures, whether in real life and or in feelings of economic security, are squeezing the ability of many people to be generous.
mm-hmm.
Second, religious Canadians are much more generous than non religious Canadians for several reasons that the research explores in greater detail. But as religiosity continues to decline, so does generosity. And
Mm,
third, there's an ongoing shift in social values and principles, in part related to the loss of religiosity. Younger adults have a lower appreciation of social giving norms, lower recognition that charities need their help, and they're less likely to feel a responsibility to help.
mm.
They're more likely to feel that the government is responsible, not them.
Interesting.
So, yeah, very interesting stuff here. And I was wondering if maybe you could, having heard this now, reflect on those three things maybe from your perspective.
Mm-hmm. Well, I find it interesting, first of all, to one, the stats in Canada. I am
Mm,
surprised and I am
mm.
disappointed.
Yeah,
I'll
yeah.
be honest, I'm disappointed. But it makes sense when we talk about virtue. Often that word is in a faith or spirituality context or a
Mm-hmm.
greater spiritual community in terms of the world. So it's not surprising in some ways that it's tied into the results. So
Mm-hmm.
let me
Yeah.
go further. First of all, when I looked at this list, I'm going to start with the second reason in terms
Mm,
of religiosity. But when I looked at the list, it was interesting to me that the United States jumped out
mm.
at to me as number three.
Number three.
Now,
Yep.
American born dual citizenship here.
Yes. Yes.
But I think it also speaks to number two in terms of the loss of religiosity in that connection.
Mm.
Giving what I know of the US, in God we trust, is literally on the currency.
Right.
There are areas of the US known as the Bible Belt.
Mm-hmm.
The US would identify themselves as a Christian nation.
Mm-hmm.
And so many of us also watch with mixed emotions the recent US elections in November. And many of those politicians signed off as God bless America, right?
Mm-hmm.
Knowing that they largely regard themselves as religious, then that makes sense in terms of the
Mm-hmm.
numbers
Mm-hmm.
based on even if the religion is more tradition than practice, it makes
Right.
sense it ranks so high on generosity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Um, I'm going to explore a bit on the economic pressures.
Mm.
Absolutely, that makes sense to me. I believe there's a growing disparity between classes in many parts of the world, and the economic landscape is changing rapidly. Folks are having trouble making ends meet, and so it's less likely they're going to be taking from their own pockets to give to other people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Which then leads me to the third reason in terms of people's view of government. There are
Mm.
many who believe the government is mismanaging our financial resources
Yep.
and that the government's generosity is overextended to folks outside our borders. And this is creating a growing resentment and
Mm.
increasing folks' expectation that the government then should be using those
Mm.
tax dollars to support folks here rather
Mm-hmm.
than across the borders. And because there's this growing perception that Canadian tax dollars are grossly out of proportion for foreign support versus domestic support, people are voting with their pocketbooks and
Mm.
not contributing as the case may be.
Mm, yeah. Good reflections. I
Interesting.
think you're right for sure.
Hmm. So we're becoming less generous. Stats are very clear on this and various reasons. But let's bring it back to the good life, the good and flourishing life. How
Mm.
exactly does being generous contribute to finding and living a healthy, flourishing life?
Mm-hmm. Well, let me take you just briefly into the Sermon on the Mount, tell you exactly what Jesus says about giving. And then I want to tease out what I think are three things that we can take away from this as we think about the good life. But Jesus says this: when you give to the needy, do
Hmm.
not announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues on the streets to be honored by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
when you give to the needy, do not know what your left hand, or do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you. Now,
Hmm.
I think there are three things going on here, at least three, but I'll keep it at three. First, Jesus starts with actually how not to give.
Hmm.
And that is, don't give for self esteem or to build your brand. And as I think about this, in all of life, there's this ever present temptation to
Hmm.
advertise ourselves or brand ourselves as pious, generous, so that others will see it and think well of us.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
I was thinking of it just this Christmas season, out shopping a little bit. I'm intrigued by this whole checkout philanthropy or point of sale fundraising. So you go to buy
Okay.
something and they ask you as you're checking out, hey, you want to donate $2 to this, that, or whatever.
Yep. Yep.
Now I've noticed something about myself and I have a hunch others are like me. I could be wrong. But when I go to a self checkout, right, at the grocery store, wherever, so I don't have to interact with a human being, I
Hmm.
go to the self checkout and it says, would you like to, on the screen, would you like to donate $2 to whatever?
Hmm.
Maybe it's just me, but I have never, Grace, in my life, not once at the self checkout have I donated to
Hmm.
whatever cause they're promoting. But when I approach the cashier, an actual human being, and I know there's someone behind me who's listening or someone in front of me who just donated to said cause, I'm
Okay.
much more likely
Hmm.
to say in that moment, okay, I will donate as well. And in that moment, let's be honest, it's mostly about
Hmm.
I don't
Hmm.
want to look cheap. I want to look generous to the cashier, the person behind me, whatever. And I think that's what Jesus is getting at here. We don't have
Hmm.
like the Pharisees, people blowing trumpets when they do, but there's, whether it's on social media posts, maybe, or even just the way we can maybe sneak stories in about our generosity, there's
Hmm.
always
Hmm.
a
Hmm.
temptation to use generosity to make ourselves look better. And I think what Jesus is saying, look, that's a dead end because it's a never ending game, always trying to
Hmm.
keep up with making yourself look good. So I think that's what Jesus is getting at there.
Mm. Well, I want to affirm your vulnerability in
Yeah.
sharing these experiences. I am less likely to, click that option and self-checkout as well. And I think for me, it does make it easier to say no, because like you said, there's no person attached to it. It's just
Right.
screen, no.
Yeah. Yeah.
Move me
Exactly.
through the options here. In terms of the publicity and the branding, it made me think of this recent news story that came out regarding Kansas City Chiefs quarterback Patrick Mahomes. I'm a
Oh,
football fan.
interesting. Yeah. Okay.
And Mahomes was being called out by a former Kansas City player, Mitchell Schwartz, for the Christmas gifts he gives his offensive line.
Huh.
So it's a standing tradition that the quarterback will give gifts to his players, specifically
Okay.
offensive line. And Brad, these are high-end gifts.
I don't doubt it.
Rolex, Yeti, Oakley, like
Right. Right.
adding up to thousands of dollars per player. And I did a little research. So I'm like, well, how many players are we talking here? Anywhere from 10 players to 30 players. If you're talking
Wow.
about 10 for the first string, second and third, and
Wow.
sometimes
Okay.
fourth string players. So thousands of dollars per players. So we're adding up the math here. 10 players,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
$1,000 each. That's
Yeah, that's
10,000, even if
a
it's
lot of
right.
money.
But Schwartz's issue was not the value of the gifts, but the gifts seem less personal and more about the brands Mahomes actually
Mm.
represents. And
Mm,
so it was more of a public image on display versus what he felt should have been a personal thank you to these people who have made him to
mm,
be. And so
mm-hmm.
it was publicized, even put on display the different gifts on the chief's social media pages.
Right.
So there was a
Right.
lot of public
Mm,
attention towards these gifts. And to your point, this is what Jesus is calling out. You know, the
yeah.
trumpets, the social media, the in the therapeutic world or psychology worlds, it's a sort of covert narcissism where your
Mm-hmm.
image is like on the down low, you're presenting yourself as this amazing person, but underneath the motive is not as pure as it would
Mm.
appear.
Hmm. Yeah, and I mean, this is something all sorts of corporations are involved today, right? I mean,
Mm,
we look like a better brand if we also look generous, and I think
mm,
this is precisely the kind of thing Jesus is warning against. Not that giving is bad; it's good, but
mm,
keep it secret. It doesn't need to be so publicized. So, a giving or generosity that's solely concerned with how we appear, that's
mm,
where there's dangers.
mm-hmm,
Now,
mm-hmm,
in simplest terms, I think Jesus is just cautioning us here not to find our value in what others think of us or what we do, which is, of course, easier said than done.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
But it brings me back to the personal. When you're working with clients and you sense that they find worth, say, or value in how others are evaluating them, be that through success or generosity, how do you counsel them? How do you work with that?
mm-hmm. Yes, can see often how distressing it is for clients to keep up appearances or expectations that others have for them versus what they want for themselves. And our work together, there's a lot of reflection time funneling down to the why. Why are
Mm,
they doing what they're doing? Why do they feel influenced by other people's opinions, expectations, etc.? And often it's rooted in fear.
mm,
Fear of not being accepted, fear of being excluded, fear of not being enough.
mm,
There's a lot of social pressure about the enoughness we feel like we need to prove. And our work together helps clients build a strong and growing sense of value in themselves, no matter who is looking or judging. You
mm.
know, another word for that we've talked about before is congruency. How
Yeah.
I'm showing up is reflected externally and internally. And
Mhm.
then over time, the work we do helps them build the strength of living authentically. And that often starts to outweigh the fear and the emotional distress and even exhaustion people feel living under a mask.
Mm.
And it takes
Yeah.
time. It takes time.
Yeah, absolutely.
So these are really, really great principles on how not to give or why not to give in order to find our worth in others. So why do you think Jesus includes giving and generosity within a sermon about finding the flourishing life? Why do you think these
Yeah,
principles are
yeah,
being highlighted?
yeah. And that's a great question. And I think, as we go through the sermon, it's important to always keep that in mind. This isn't an isolated verse.
Mm,
Jesus throughout the whole sermon has the flourishing good life in mind. So how does that connect with generosity? Well, there's a few things in this passage I think easy to miss, but I want to highlight. First is giving and generosity are assumed by Jesus to be non-optional components of the
mm,
Jesus pass. So
mm-hmm.
twice Jesus says when you give to the needy, not if, right?
Okay.
And so it's expected. In fact, it comes from the long tradition of the Hebrew scriptures where giving to the poor
Mm-hmm.
or needy was baked into laws. So there was tax laws, but there was also don't plow all your fields, leave some for that. Like that was baked into law, not just, hey,
Mm,
this would be a nice thing if you did it. It's baked into the law. And, I think so often we see giving and generosity as growing in virtue or goodness, and rightfully so. I think the more virtuous become, the more generous we become. But
mm-hmm.
I might suggest that on the Jesus path, giving and generosity are more obligation than virtue. And you might be like, whoa, why? That
Mm,
seems a little
mm,
strange. Well, this is the third point here. Giving or generosity for Jesus isn't about altruism.
mm,
And I find that fascinating because altruism is the belief in or practice of disinterested and selfless concern for the well being of others.
mm,
What's
mm-hmm.
interesting to me is there's none of that actually here in Jesus' teaching. This isn't about being selfless because right at the end, there's a promised reward. If you're
Okay.
generous, if you give, your Father in heaven will reward you. So this isn't altruism. Now, it's easy to get stuck on thinking, okay, what does that mean? Some pie in the sky later reward. And there may very well be an element to that.
Mhm.
But I think what's going on here is actually radical self interest, because I think what Jesus assumes is that giving is its own reward.
Okay. Hmm.
Being generous and giving is about manifesting and living into a healthy, whole, flourishing life. And so it's
Mm.
in our best interest to be generous, which flies against everything within us a lot of times, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because without a regular practice of generosity, giving to those in need, especially the ones right in front of us, right? The
Mm-hmm.
danger, I think, is this, is that our soul hardens and we
Mm-hmm.
become cold, and our attitudes can shift from a spirit of mercy to one of indifference, and we're distrustful of people, maybe even disgust with certain people, anger, moral superiority. And I think the risk of not being generous is we become indifferent, maybe even mean. And I
Mm-hmm.
just think in the good and flourishing life, there's no space for mean hearts. It's almost diabolical. It's the antithesis of a good life to become a mean and
Mm-hmm.
hard person, right? And so the work of giving and generosity, I think the reward Jesus is speaking of is to protect ourselves from being mean and to keep us consistently following the way of
Mm-hmm.
mercy, you could see. So that's
Mm-hmm.
what I think's going on there.
There's a lot there, as you said. There's a lot to
Mm.
unpack, and we've
Mm.
narrowed it down to three. But that's powerful. Mercy, that's another
Mm.
virtue,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Absolutely.
It makes me think of the ongoing debate about people who
Mm.
panhandle or ask for money,
Mm-hmm.
set up on intersections and whatnot. And I believe that there's a lot of judgment and misconceptions that can lead people to not be generous
Right.
in that situation. There's no way of knowing if this person is a scammer or is truly in need. There really
Mm-hmm.
isn't.
No.
And here's the thing, even if giving money at the intersection makes a person uncomfortable,
Mm-hmm.
there are numerous charities who do provide
Yeah,
support,
yeah, yeah.
and
Absolutely.
they would be thrilled to take your
Mm.
generous and
Mm-hmm.
charitable contribution. And frankly, as we talked about earlier on in this episode, the needs are growing.
Mm. Absolutely, and I think even reflecting on if this is what's going on here with Jesus teaching, it sort of changes the equation with the panhandler, because it can always be like, I might actually be doing damage if I give them money and they use it on something that's not good for themselves. But again, that's the other focus. There's the,
Hmm.
what does it do to me if I consistently drive by that person or consistently walk over top of that person sleeping on, like something's also
Hmm.
happening to me when I ignore that. And so I
Hmm.
think what's going on here is Jesus sort of coaching us whenever we're tempted to be mean or stingy, have mercy, right?
Hmm.
When we're tempted to shame or criticize or condemn, be merciful instead. And
Hmm.
this crosses all sorts of things when we're having a political disagreement, a theological disagreement, even when we're absolutely sure we're right or feel certain that our money is our own. I worked hard for it. I'm going to keep it.
Hmm.
Be merciful, be generous. And I think an active practice of generosity, what it does is it keeps our souls from hardening,
Hmm.
becoming mean. And that's a great way to find happiness, goodness, and flourishing in
Hmm.
life.
Absolutely. And we can take our cues from some of these other countries who, from our perspective, would be less financially stable
Mm,
and
absolutely.
how generous they are. Like
Mm,
there's something powerful there. And
yeah.
so if you want to live the good and flourishing life, be generous.
Mm-hmm.
That's not only encouraged by theology, as exampled by Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, but evidence based in psychology,
Mm-hmm.
right? People feel better. People have stronger mental and physical well being when they have an attitude of generosity.
Right.
So maybe we all can, in this new year, review our
Mm-hmm.
budgets
Yep.
and find more room for generosity.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us here on the Sacred Sofa, listeners. Welcome back to 2025.
Mm.
Great to be back with you, Brad.
Yes.
Take good
Thanks
care.
always for your wisdom and what you bring to this. Thank you. And yes, we'll see you next time.
See you next time.